Hello, everyone. We've got Barbara Kracht with us today in our podcast series, Communicating in a Crisis. So thanks for joining me today, Barbara. And if you could just give a quick introduction of who you are, your experience, so that we can get to know you.
Thank you very much, Elmarie, for the opportunity. I was head of Airbus Media Relations for many years, throughout from the beginning of Airbus up to 10 years ago. And as such, I've experienced quite a number of crises, all types of crises, managerial ones, program delays, and regrettably also accidents. And this gave me a real insight in what, from an insider's point of view, you have to do in terms of communication. Because very often from the outside, you see the obvious one, which is, of course, media coverage, social media, etc., families, of course, but you don't see the rest. But from the inside, you realize that communication is a much broader scope and really an entity, a pillar of crisis management per se.
Thanks, Barbara. And I know that since you've left Airbus, you have been an independent consultant, consulting to a variety of companies in crisis, specifically also aviation disasters since then. We've certainly worked alongside you and have seen the quality of your work. I'd love to talk today. So our last podcast was from the perspective of a journalist, and today I'd love to learn more about, as an organization, the landscape has changed quite a bit, but our stakeholders have remained the same. But how we communicate, when we communicate, which platforms do we use to communicate with them is something I want to explore with you today. So I want to think about, as an organization, let's use the example of an aviation disaster, but it really could be any huge loss of reputation, loss of life, loss of infrastructure, something that really affects your customers and your staff. Who should we think about communicating in these situations? How and when?
Yeah. Say, to explain and to put in the global context, communication very often is considered as a subpart of emergency response, very often. And it's not the case. This is why I would say that for the global crisis management, there are three pillars. On the one hand, you have emergency response, which is dealing with the crisis itself, the consequences of the crisis, families, victims, etc., and the causes. This is de facto emergency response, and this is where Go Crisis comes in a lot, of course, and helps. On the other side, crisis management also involves business continuity. Because while you are affected, take a hotel, you have a fire in a hotel, but the hotel has guests, has bookings, and you have to think ahead, how do you continue? Or you mentioned an airline, how do you continue to operate while one of your aircraft is completely out of service, your personnel is affected, you may have people not wanting to go to fly, for example, that has happened, and things like that. So this is the other big pillar of crisis management. And the third one is really crisis communication. Because nowadays, with the modern means of communicating and social media especially, everybody can communicate with everybody at all times. You post a tweet, you post a note on Facebook, and it's basically available. Forget about saying, oh, it's just to a group of friends, because the friends will relay it to another friend and another friend, and it goes public. So anything you communicate to one target audience goes to the other. So communication is to set up a strategy of what you communicate and to whom. And you have to communicate basically simultaneously to all your stakeholders. They are, of course, obviously, first and foremost, families, relatives, the affected ones, etc., etc. You think of the media, of course, these are the two obvious ones. But there are many others, particularly internal communication. You have to continue motivating your personnel. You want to continue to operate. You want to demonstrate to them that you are capable of taking care, because your personnel has also, in a way or another, be affected. If you have a hotel fire, your personnel is affected. Some may have been injured. So this has an effect on the other employees. And you need them to help you, to support you in the crisis, but also for business continuity. So it's very important to keep them on your side and to motivate them and communicate with them. But then,
100%.
sorry.
Sorry, Barbara, I just want to explore the employees a little bit, because I think that's so important. And before we do that, I just want to quickly come back to your pillars. It is, I love how you explain that. You've got crisis management in the middle, and then you've got your emergency or crisis response, where you have your structure, your team, your people responding to the crisis. You've got your pillar of business continuity, and your pillar of, like a tripod, and you've got your pillar for crisis communications. And I think in the past, we have really witnessed where organizations are really good at their communications, but there's no substance behind what they're communicating. And then you get organizations that respond really well, but they are not necessarily communicating what they are doing. So it feels, the company is idle, they're not responding well. So we always say what you do and then do what you say, and they really have to back each other up. But back to the employees, we have also seen how some of our clients who have gone through crisis situations, those who neglect their staff end up with a snowball of a separate issue on their hands. And I think if you have a strong organization with a staff that believes in the brand, that believe in your organization and in your leadership, and you communicate well in crisis at that time, that they are your biggest advocates in times of crisis. They will continue your operations. They will speak to other people and be an advocate for your brand about what's being done. They will be passionate about doing the right thing to support the organization through this crisis, and of course the affected people. So we must not forget about communicating with them. And I suppose communicating with your staff would normally be not, of course your external messages, they will be, they will see those, but the internal channels that you usually use, I would rely on those too. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. And this is what I was going to say. Then you have all the other stakeholders, if I may give the global picture, because you have all your business partners, the suppliers, but also the travel agencies, whoever you are doing business with. And they want to be reassured. But you have also government officials very often. Either they are your shareholders or not your shareholders. You have your shareholders, actually, if you are a stock listed company. They all want to know, and everybody understands that an accident can happen. But where you are going to really be judged on is on the way you respond and on the way you are able to continue running your business. And this is where really communication, and as you rightly say, you have to have substance, but you have to be very proactive in communicating both things. What you are doing on the one hand to respond to the crisis, that is the crisis, the emergency response, and that you are on top of it, usually with the help of a company like Go Crisis. But on the other side, you have to demonstrate that you can run your business, that you continue, that you can overcome the hurdle. And these messages, of course, have to be tailored then to all the various stakeholders, because you don't communicate in the same way to a family or to an investor. But the role of crisis communication, and this is an organization which has to be thought of beforehand. Who is going to be in charge of defining the message? Of course, it has to be done on the roof. You have the three pillars, and you have the roof, which is crisis management, to be defined there and agreed there with the head of crisis management communication, and then trickle down. Now, communication cannot do everything. You need to have entities, for example, in internal comms, who will relay the message, or investor relations talking to the investors, etc., etc. And one thing is very important. It is the role in a crisis, basically the key role of a CEO and its top executives is to communicate. I've heard in certain cases where they thought they have to run the emergency response. It is not their role there. Of course, they have to be briefed regularly of what is happening in order to be able to make strategic decisions. Along with lawyers, they have to be involved with the insurers who sit in the crisis management team. But let the emergency response team run what is their business, as you would let operations run by operations. You don't interfere, the CEO does not interfere on a day-to-day basis in the operations or in cabin handling or luggage handling. So everybody has a responsibility. This organization needs to be set up and tried before a crisis, of course. But again, I repeat, the key role of the CEO and of the top management is to communicate and to communicate credibly to these various stakeholders, because they are the image of the company. They reflect what the company has to be said. And basically, they have to assume in a certain way also responsibility, which again does not mean guilt. Very often lawyers get confused between assuming responsibility versus and think it means you're guilty. No, I always remember the typical example everybody will remember of Tony Fernandez saying, I'm the CEO of this company. They were my guests on my flight, so I feel responsible. It didn't mean he's guilty, but he has the responsibility of taking care of what is happening. So this is a very good example of how to handle things and how to communicate. Now, the CEO cannot be everywhere. You can, of course, do press conferences, you can visit the families, you can talk to the investor relations, but you have to use other tools. For example, nowadays, and it's often forgotten, after the usual statements, press releases have become obsolete nowadays. You communicate through Twitter, through Facebook, and you have to have a constant flow of information. If you use I'm talking about external communication, for example, but also use videos. Record videos and post them with statements, very short statements of the CEO, because the public wants images. Everybody talks. Everybody gives interviews. So you have to have as many interviews as possible, just with your key messages. Use that. Post it very quickly. What you say on a tweet can be said by the CEO and posted. So you have an image to give to TVs, to whoever. So these are tools nowadays which didn't exist in the old days, which help because you can communicate much more effectively. And again, it's very important to always show sympathy, empathy, and care for what you're doing for those affected and that you're assuming responsibility. I keep repeating that.
That's very interesting. And to come back to the CEO, it's such a valid point. Especially smaller organizations, we see the CEO, and I can associate with that emotion where something has gone seriously wrong, and the CEO wants to really be involved in trying to fix that. But it's so vital that you have a team that you can trust to run with the emergency or the crisis response with you. You've got your communications team that you can trust to draft the messages that you will then deliver. But your job is not to be the actual doer in the crisis management center. Your job is to front your organization as a leader, to communicate confidently with empathy, like you said, to relay that message. We've been involved very recently in fatalities where the CEO had to do a handwritten letter to the families and also to, the affected people. Those kind of things take such a small effort, but it goes such a long way to show that personal commitment and involvement and empathy.
Absolutely. And there is one more thing I say. This is what I've experienced when sitting in crisis rooms at Airbus. In the beginnings, everybody wanted to sit there when the first Airbus aircraft were involved in accidents, knowing what is happening, etc., etc. And in the end, we realized, well, the first information we get is what we get from the media, and it's just a matter of setting up the logistics and organizing the go team, the aircraft to fly there, etc., etc. So, and then what you need is really occasional briefs going up to the crisis management. This is why I say the three pillars, and on top, the roof is the crisis management. Okay, regular briefings up there. The other point I'd like to make, and which is also very important, is about lawyers. Because communication is immediate. Lawyers, they have the eternity for them. Sorry for the lawyers. But
Barbara, I'm married to a lawyer. I know exactly what you mean.
but they are not under that pressure. And then they are they are very cautious. And very often they would prefer not to say anything. And I would like here to quote the example of Panam and Lockerbie. I think most of the audience nowadays hardly remembers Lockerbie because it's so many years back, but still, it was a Pan Am flight from Frankfurt to New York a few days before Christmas, and there was a bomb on board. And because the aircraft was late departing from Frankfurt, 20 minutes late, instead of exploding over the Atlantic, it exploded over northern Scotland, and the debris fell over the village of Lockerbie. That's why it's known as Lockerbie. Of course, there were students on board, a whole class of students, and one of the key contributors of the demise of Pan Am was the fact that the CEO was not allowed to communicate by its lawyers. They refused because they thought that if he communicated, he would be considered responsible, equal guilty. And they prevented him from communicating. And this is what really made the families furious. It was the first time that a family, a family team was created, and they went vocal, and they really hated Pan Am for that, for not communicating properly. And in the end, it was the CEO wanted, I know from their former head of comms, that he wanted them to communicate, the CEO wanted to communicate, the lawyers decided no. And we've seen recently, if you go through the press and recent crisis cases, that very often the lawyers and maybe also the financial guys say, don't communicate or don't admit or don't recognize. But the truth will catch up. So it's always better to be ahead of the cockpit, as we say in aviation, that is, ahead of the issue and control, rather than having to respond to leaks from third parties about something what is obvious.
Yeah. And it's something that I find so simple and obvious, like you say, also, where, it takes so little to recognize, to acknowledge reports, to be able to say you are sorry, that your thoughts are with those who've been affected, that you are working with authorities, that you've deployed your Go team to support the families. There's so much that you can say on behalf of your organization that does not even touch the cause of the incident, or that does not even touch the fact that you may or may not be guilty. That comes out of investigation later. That's not our position to talk about that anyway.
Yeah,
But
but
there's so much that you can say that shows such a reliable, empathetic response that people can go to you for to be, a source of information, that people feel confident in your response and in your leadership.
absolutely. But even later on, when there are negative things coming out of your company, and in the end, these are facts, don't try, lawyers will say deny it because they want to protect you. But from a comms perspective, if these are real facts, you can do whatever you want, they will remain facts. So it's better acknowledge and leapfrog in a way the issue by saying, yes, but we are taking remedies, we are doing this, etc., which shows you are assuming responsibility rather than denying it, because it will come back and bite you. It's easy to say, but very often there are decisions which are taken and where comms is not always the leader in the decision-making process. But later they pay for it. And I've seen that time and again.
Yeah. I think it's finding that balance, but maybe, I mean, this is another thing that we really always try and insist on is when you run an exercise, when you run your scenario and you get your crisis management team together, to have the lawyers in that training, in the exercises. When we do crisis comms training, for the lawyers to be involved in that, for them to get that understanding. And, it's also not us against the lawyers, of course. I've been in many incidents where the lawyers have been a real support, and they did double check the comms. And of course, we have to find that balance between, what is being said and, what you need to sort of maybe phrase slightly different. I understand that there's a balance to be found. But I have been in incidents where lawyers have been incredibly helpful, and in incidents where lawyers have been incredibly reluctant. And I think that reluctance is to limit your liability, which always boils down to money. That's it.
Yeah.
It boils down to money. So the cost of the brand damage to your business can often be more expensive than the liability that the lawyers are trying to protect you
Absolutely.
against. So it is just working together, and the best way to do that is to train together, to exercise together, to iron out those things, for your statements to be approved by legal beforehand, to have those things ready in different eventualities. So it's almost not us against them. We have to become one team. It will be a three-legged race. I always say crisis is a three-legged race. But what we can do is practice that beforehand so that it becomes more well-oiled. And I think this comes particularly between leadership, communications, and lawyers when it comes to preparing for your crisis comms.
Absolutely. And I would even say to include the insurers,
Yes,
because of course they have the money also, and they both need to be convinced about the value precisely of communicating properly and openly and not trying to hide things, because as you say, it will come and bite you. And if it bites you afterwards, it ends up becoming much more expensive, because as in the case of Panam, but I could mention many other cases, uh, then the public gets angry, the families get angry, and then they are much more demanding on their response. And if you have their sympathy, if they understand, okay, yes, there's been a mistake. Humans make mistakes. It's normal. We have to accept that. But accept that it was an error, you've learned from it, you will do everything, and you assume a responsibility for that. Don't shy away. And this will draw you sympathy
yeah.
also. Along with, of course, all the key messages you have to convey, as you say, all what you're doing for the families, for the assistants, etc., and what you're doing for business continuity, not to forget about your personnel, your employees, your colleagues, whom you are so reliable and so grateful for all their support and their help.
And Barbara, we spoke about communicating. You mentioned we have to now, send out these communications out simultaneously, tailored to the different audiences. And I just want to explore that a little bit. So historically, we knew we speak with the families, of course, before we speak to the media, which is absolute common sense, but it's mistakes that people still make, or organizations still make. So we communicate with affected people before we communicate externally. But we live now in a world where you say things are being live streamed, recorded, people are in constant communications with everybody. So it's important to rely very heavily on the communication structure and disseminating those messages out to the different audiences at the same time. Can you talk a little bit more about how we can think about doing that and the challenges around that very fact that we now have to communicate with everybody simultaneously, but tailored messages?
Yeah, but this is basically what needs to be trained, and for what the communication pillar has to be prepared for and know how to do it, so that once they get the message to communicate, well, of course, there are plenty in the initial hours. You can have plenty of statements ready, which can be pre-prepared. You just need to know, yes, that one can be released at that time, to whom, etc., etc. But afterwards, basically, it's to coordinate, and you say, okay, we are going to do a briefing to the families at, say, 3 p.m. So at 3:05, you have the same messages going out to the media, to social media, or to investor relations through different channels. But it's a matter of logistics and organization and thinking about it beforehand, so that you have a manual which explains all that, and you just take the checklist, and this is what we have to do at that in these circumstances, etc.
It's becoming a minefield and quite a challenge, but I think that is
Yeah,
something that you say, and it could be also tailored and unique to each organization. As the messages are tailored, your channels are tailored, your timing could be tailored. We need to think through that, and every incident also presents you with different challenges. We know, and it may be that you've got everything planned, but you may have to alter that at the time of the incident.
you have to be always flexible and adapt. And of course, as you rightly say, depending on the company, even if you take hotels or if you take an airline, their structure is different, their resources are different. So the organization has to be adapted to each context. But the basic principles have to remain the same. And the important thing is really the role of the CEO and top executives is to communicate to all stakeholders in a way or another, but they have to communicate. They are the rescuers of the reputation of the company, but they have to do it right, of course, and be prepared for that.
Barbara, thank you so much. You've got such a wealth of experience, and I know to try and condense that down in a 30-minute podcast is absolutely not the way to communicate. But I am so grateful for your time, and I'm so grateful that you've been able to condense the principles down for us in this short time. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for sharing your time and your experience with us.
Thank you, Elmarie, and thank you
Always,
for the opportunity. And
always lovely to work
all
with you,
the
and
best.
always lovely to see you.
Yeah, the same. All the best, and good luck in Jersey then,
Thank
and
you.
good, and good for the experience. What you are experiencing.
Thank you,
Okay.
Barbara.
Bye
See
bye.
you. Bye bye.
See you. Bye bye.